Hey guys, welcome to another Python tutorial for beginners. So in today's video, we'll talk about nested loops and few examples about for loops and nested for loops. So let's get into this. So in our last video, we've talked about how we can loop through the Python iterable data types such as list, tuple, set, string, and dictionary. But we haven't really talked about looping through the nested data structure, meaning what if we have to loop through a list that contains a dictionary, or to go even one level further, a string in the dictionary value. So in today's video, we'll start off by creating and looping through those nested data types. Okay, so let's first start with a simple example. So let's say that we have a list with some strings as the element, and we want to loop through each character by character within that element. So for that, let me first create a list. So I can do list1 and then square bracket Danny and put Eddie as well as Michelle. So this list1 contains three names, Danny, Eddie, and Michelle. And now let me create a for loop so that we can iterate through the list1. So we can do for name in list1 colon and then just print name. And if I just run this, then you will see Danny, Eddie, and Michelle printed out line by line. So each line means each iteration. So then this time, let's say that we want to actually loop through character by character for each name that's printed out here. So for that, we would actually have to iterate through each name once again within this outer for loop that we have. So the syntax for the nested for loop is exactly identical as the outer for loop that we have, but we will just put the second for loop below the outer for loop indented with a tab. So let me show you an example of that. So I can just do for character in name, and then I can just print the character out. So print character, and let me also delete this print statement out here. So let's quickly walk through what I did here. So we have the outer for loop as is, meaning we have the variable name, and then our target is the list1. So we're gonna actually iterate through each element by element in the list1 in the outer for loop. And in the nested for loop, meaning the second for loop, we have the variable set as a character because we'll be actually looping through each character by character within the element. And our target is the name that's being generated by the outer for loop. And this is pretty important here because the variable that you generate from the outer for loop is actually being passed to the second for loop, meaning the nested for loop, as the target that we're gonna iterate through. And at the end, I have a print statement that prints out each of the character that's generated from the second for loop that we have here. So if I run this, then you will see all the characters for all the names in the list1 printed out line by line. So let me just run this. And if you scroll to the top, then you will see all the characters printed out line by line for all the names that we have in the list1. And this is happening because the outer for loop, for the first iteration, the name variable will be Danny because that's our first index element. And so then Danny will be passed to the second for loop, which is the nested for loop that we have. And we're gonna actually iterate through once again for the given name Danny because Danny is our target. And we're gonna actually iterate then character by character because we have the string data type here. So that's why you are seeing D, A, N, Y, D being the first iteration for the second for loop, and then A being the second iteration for the second for loop, and so on until the N when it reaches the Y, which is the ending character for the name Y. Then the for loop will actually go to the outer for loop once again, and then the name for outer for loop will change to Eddie because that's our second iteration. And then same as before, Eddie will be passed to the second for loop, which is the name here, and then we're gonna actually print out each of the character by character for the given name Eddie as you see here. And same thing happens for the Michelle. So if we scroll to the very end, the ending character is E, which is the ending character for the Michelle that we have here. So to show you what I just explained in action, I can put another print statement right below the outer for loop. So I can do print name here. So what's gonna happen now is that the first iteration for the outer for loop will be Danny, and then the print statement will print out the Danny, and then it's gonna go to second iteration and print out all the characters for Danny, and same goes for the Eddie and Michelle. So by printing the print statement here, we can clearly see which variable is being iterated through for the outer for loop as well as the inner for loop. So let me just run this one more time. And if we scroll to the top, then you see the name Danny printed out from this print statement, and below this second iteration actually gets started and it prints out all the characters for Danny as you see in below, and then it goes to outer for loop once again, and so that's why you are seeing Eddie here, and you will see all the characters for Eddie, and same goes for Michelle. And once it actually reaches the ending character, which is E, for the ending element that we have in the list1, the for loop just automatically gets terminated, meaning that the entire iteration just stops because we actually reaches the ending element as well as the ending character within these two for loops that we have here. Okay, so then now let's talk about the control statements such as break and continue within the nested for loop that we have. By the way, if you need a recap about the control statement of the for loop, please click the right hand corner. So let's assume that if the current iteration for the second for loop that we have, if the character is equal to y, then we want to continue, meaning we want to move to the next iteration. Otherwise, we want to print the characters. So for that, I can just put a simple if statement here. So if character is equal to y, colon, I want to continue, meaning I want to move to the next iteration. Otherwise, I want to print a character out. So if I just run this one more time, and if I scroll up, then you will see the name Danny coming out from this print statement, and you will see all the characters for Danny. However, you will not see y, because if the character is y, it just ran the continue statement and it moved to the next iteration. But since the y was the ending character for Danny, the iteration for the second for loop just ended there, and then it went to the outer for loop iteration and it moved to the next name, which is Eddie. That's why you are seeing the Eddie right below words without the y. And same goes for the Eddie. So Eddie has a y here. So if I scroll down here, you will see the character EDD, but you will not see y because the same thing happened. And that's why you are seeing the next name, which is the Michelle here. So then now let me try to replace this continue statement with a break statement. And then let me also replace this y with a. And if I run this one more time, and if I scroll up, then you will see the name Danny coming out from this print statement, but you will only see character D printed out without the rest of the characters. So what happened here is that when the second iteration, the character was A, then it went inside this if block, and then the break statement was run. So the entire iteration for the second for loop was just instantly terminated, and that's why it went to the outer for loop, and then it moved to the next name, which is Eddie, and that's why you are seeing the name Eddie right below words. And since we put the break statement inside the second for loop, only the second for loop was exited out for the name Danny, because the name Danny was the only element that contained the character A. Okay, so then now let's try to talk about the nested for loop using the range function and then the indexes generated from the range function. So for that, let me create the nested for loop here. So I can do for I in range 4, and then I'm gonna put the print statement here. So print, this is an outer loop, so outer loop string formatting, and then dot format, and put I here. And below I'm gonna put the nested for loop. So for j in range, and then as the argument I'm gonna put I, which is generated from the outer for loop, and then put another print statement. So print inner loop, and then string formatting, format, and then put j here. And let's run this and see what happens. So let's walk through the result here, why this result was generated. So in the first iteration of the outer for loop, this I will be 0, because as we learned, the range function by default starts from 0 if you don't specify the start index. We only have the stop index of 4 here, so that's why by default it started from 0, and that's why the print statement for the outer loop prints out the 0 here, but we don't see any print statement for inner loop, and this is happening because there is no positive value less than 0, and so that this second range function will not iterate through anything. Meaning the second iteration was just skipped because we put 0 as the stop index into this range function in the second nested for loop. So then now for the second iteration for the outer for loop, the I will be 1. And when this 1 was passed to the second for loop, and 1 is the stop index, and then the stop index is exclusive, then the only integer that the range function will generate in the second for loop will be 0. And that's because 0 is the last value that the range function will process. And that's why we see one print statement saying that inner loop is 0. So then now in the next line of the result, we see the outer loop equal to 2. So it printed out this outer loop is 2, and then it went inside the second nested for loop and passed the 2 into this range function, and then this time the first iteration for the range function will be 0, and then the second iteration will be 1, and it's gonna stop there because the stop index of 2 is exclusive, and that's why you are seeing the outer loop 2, and then in below you see the inner loop of 0 and inner loop of 1. And finally, if the outer for loop iteration generates the index of 3, meaning the I is 3, then it's gonna print out the outer for loop of 3, and then it's gonna go inside the nested for loop, inside the range function, and pass the 3 as the argument here, and iterate through the 0, 1, and 2, but not 3 because the stop index is exclusive. So if we scroll down to below, you will see the outer loop 3 printed out here, and you will see the inner loop of 0, 1, and 2 right below words. Okay, so now we went through a few basic examples of nested for loop. Let's try to work with a bit more complicated data structure that has a nested dictionary, string, and list. So for that, let me copy and paste the data structure here. And let me walk through this individual list real quick. So each individual in the individual list is a dictionary. So you will see a 3 individual total. So you can see a dictionary here. The curly brace start from here and end at here. So this is your first individual, and we have the second individual here and third individual at the very bottom. And each individual contains 2 elements. The first element is the personal info, which contains another dictionary with a name and nickname. And the second element is the programming language, and it actually contains a list as a value that specifies the programming language that each individual is actually using. So now we have our data structure ready. Let's talk about how we can actually iterate through this individual list. So as usual, we'll start with the initial for loop. So for that, let me just create a simple for loop here. So I'm going to say for individual, because we are iterating through the individual list, in individual list colon, and let me just print the individual out for now. And if I run this, then you will see a 3 dictionary, meaning 3 individuals printed out line by line, because we actually iterated through the individual list, which had 3 dictionaries inside it. And as you can see, each individual is a dictionary. And within the dictionary, we have 2 elements. The first element is the personal info, and then the second element is the programming language. So if I were to iterate through this dictionary, I need to have a nested for loop. So for that, let me create another for loop here. So for in the key, meaning the individual key, comma, individual value in individual dot items. So as you can see, I'm calling the items method on the dictionary data type. And because I'm calling the items method, I can have access to individual key and value in the same for loop. Okay, so colon, and then I can just do print int key comma int value, and let me put this print statement above the second for loop here. And so if I run this one more time, then you will be able to see all the individual printed out from this print statement, as well as all the elements that belongs to the individual dictionary. So if I scroll to the top, then you will see the personal info and programming language, which is the individual dictionary that's printed out from here, as well as you will see 2 elements. The first element has the key of the personal info, and then the second element has the key of programming language. And same goes for the 2 other individuals. So here is the second individual, and here we have a third individual here. But right now it's kind of hard to distinguish between the individuals, so that let's try to have some counter here so that we can have a distinction between individual 1, 2, and 3. So for that, let me just use the enumerate function. So enumerate, and then in here I'm gonna call this as the individual counter, comma, and in here let's try to reformat this. So I can say individual number and string formatting here, dot format, and then put the individual counter plus 1, because we want to actually start from 1 instead of 0. So if I print this one more time, and if I scroll to the top, now it's a lot more cleaner. It has a label of individual 1, and then it has all the elements for the personal info and programming language coming out. And let's also not forget to actually put the value of individual. And then, so if I run this one more time, then you will see the individual 1 label with the individual dictionary, as well as all the elements printed out below each individual label that we have. Okay, so now we have a 2 for loop, one being nested to the other for loop, which is the individual dictionary. So if you look at the data structure that we have, you can see that the programming language actually have a list, and this list is actually another data type that we can actually iterate through. So let's try to have another iteration, meaning another nested for loop within the second for loop that we have here. So for that, let me just simply delete this for now, and I can just say for language, because we're gonna actually loop through the programming language list that we have. In, I'm gonna say int value colon, and I can say print language. So if I run this as is, you will see all the values in the personal info as well as the programming language, which is not the result that we want. And this is happening because in here we are not specifying anything, but we are just taking the int values, which is this dictionary here as well as this list here, and then we are looping through that. So in this case, you will see the name and nickname, which is the key for the dictionary printed out, and for the programming language, you will see all the elements in here printed out. So just as an example, let's just print this out. So if I run this, then If I scroll to the top, then you will see the individual label coming out from this print statement. And in this print statement, you will see the name, nickname, which is the key for the personal info dictionary, as well as you will see all the languages like Python and JavaScript printed out. So in this case, we need to actually find a way where we can actually restrict our target to the programming language list, not the personal info dictionary. So for that, we can just simply write an if statement right above the third for loop that we have here. So in here, I can just filter it out. So I can just say if int key equal to the programming language colon, then I want to for loop. So let me just tap this, and if I just run this one more time, then this time you will see the individual label coming out from this print statement, as well as you will only see the programming languages printed out line by line coming out from the last for loop that we have here. Okay, so then now let me also try to put the counter for the programming language that we have here. So for that, let me just use the enumerate here as well, and then put the counter here, counter comma, and in here we can just do some formatting. So I can say language, and then I just say language number, and then string formatting here, format, and then put the counter here. And I want to also put the language, so another curly braces and comma here, and put the language. And let me also delete this individual, because for now our goal is to actually print out all the programming languages within the nested data structure that we have. So if I run this one more time, now you have the individual 1 with the language of 0, and 1 with the Python, JavaScript, and individual 2 with the C# and SQL, and individual 3 have 3 languages, HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And let me also do a +1 on this counter so that the counter can actually start from 1. So run this one more time. Then now you'll see the same result, individual 1, 2, 3 with the correct labeling, language 1, Python, JavaScript, and so on for all the individuals that we have. So then now let's recap about this iterating through the nested data structure using the for loop. As we saw in this example, based on your data structure and your logic inside your program, we can iterate through the given data structure multiple times. And you can pass the variable for a specific for loop to its children, and that variable can also be used in all the nested for loops. Meaning the individual variable within the outer for loop can be accessed in the second for loop and third for loop, and same goes for the int value. So the int value can be reached in the last for loop that we have here. But there's a thing that we have to remember and be careful of. When you have too many nested for loops, it's likely that you will face some performance issues. Because when we look at this example here, all the iteration in this nested for loop structure does not get terminated until the iteration is actually completed, meaning the for loop actually reached the end of the element. Currently, this nested for loop generates a result instantly because the data that we have is pretty small. But if you assume that you have thousands of individuals and programming languages, the iteration will take a lot longer than what we currently see here. And in order for us to properly analyze the performance of a program or iteration like this, we have to consider the time and space complexities. And I think that we will get into this topic in a more advanced Python tutorial, which I'll be creating in near time. Okay guys, that's it for this video. I hope that this video gave you a bit more understanding of how to create and utilize the nested for loop to get the desired output in your program. In our next video, we will actually go through a bit more practical example of using for loop, and then we will jump into while loop, which is another method of iteration in Python. So please stay tuned, and if you haven't subscribed already, please click the subscribe and like button. Thank you so much for watching, and hope to see you in next videos.